Welcome, everybody, to the second episode of Debate Simplified. My name is Jack Young. I'm a debater at the Barclay Forum at Emory University. I'm a former debater at Montgomery Bell Academy and currently work with MBA. I'm also officially now a contributor for Policy Debate Central. This is our series where we simplify complex concepts in debate using real-world examples and more easy explanations. This episode will be talking about debating framework with policy affirmatives. So the negative has read a K, and your task is to read framework. So let's get into it. What is a critique? So before we talk about framework itself, we need to talk about critiques. In episode 1, I talked about mutual exclusivity and counterpoint competition, mostly in the terms of process counterpoints. And when thinking about Ks in framework, you should sort of have the same logic. The K is not, as we detailed previously in the last episode, a negative advocacy, in the same way that a counterpoint is not just a negative advocacy. It is an argument that attempts to disprove the desirability of the affirmative. Framework is a determination of how a judge should view mutual exclusivity and desirability of the affirmative. It is a framework for the debate, and it identifies which types of link arguments are permitted. So, if we, at this point, you know that a critique focuses less maybe on the exact, more objective hypothetical effects of the plan, such as a disad, and does not have uniqueness because the alternative provides uniqueness. Lots of this offense becomes a question about various philosophical representations or assumptions of the 1AC, and framework, put simply, is a determination of how much that philosophical offense is legitimate grounds for contestation in a debate. So framework is a determination of whether negative K offense links to the affirmative. So naturally, the negative will want to expand what the notion of what is competitive and what links to policy arguments and policy affirmatives, and the AF will want to reduce what is competitive and what links. Now, there's essentially three paths a debate can conclude a judge evaluating with framework. The first, and obviously best for the affirmative, is no case. So the affirmative has one that all forms of critiques are unfair, and therefore the negative's critique is not a valid proof of mutual exclusivity and non-desirability of the affirmative. B, and oppositely, the negative has one that evaluating the hypothetical effects of the plan is a bad way for determining desirability. For the affirmative, this is obviously the worst case because it means that you no longer have the hypothetical enactment of the plan, which is where you're going to want to get most of your offense of. And C is some sort of hybrid approach. So the judge thinks that some types of link arguments are a determination of mutual exclusivity. Perhaps the affirmative does get plan-specific offense. And we'll talk about some of the ways in which a hybrid approach can be good for you later on. So your job, very simply, is that when you're affirmative, you have to conclude either A, that no Ks are allowed, or C, some version of a hybrid approach that helps you win the debate. Now let's talk about some genres of Ks before we get into this sort of negative offense for each sort of critique. So first, I titled structural Ks. So these are Ks premised mostly on ideology, political ideology. So for example, the capitalism K is sort of the premier example of this. If the affirmative invests in a political ideology that's problematic, for example, capitalism, then saying capitalism is responsive to the affirmative. So logic here is that if the affirmative, for example, uses the market or says that the economy is good, then the negative has valid grounds of contestation by saying that capitalism broadly is bad. 2 is a case about epistemology. The premier example here is security. These Ks involve guarding offense based off of philosophical representation. So in the case of the security K, this would be how you presented impact claims in the 1AC. And lastly, there's Ks of ontology. Ontology is the study of being. The premier example of this is Afro-pessimism and more sort of identity-focused critiques. These are more similar to structural Ks, but also maybe have some epistemological elements. They will criticize ontology in the way in which the AF grounds its ontological notion of the world, or how the AF understands the world and what exists within the world. sometimes the 1 and C will present what I'm calling a Franken K. So it's not immediately obvious which genre of the K it is until the 1 and C. Reminder that the sort of categories of critiques are, just my perspective on sort of genres and how I tend to quantify these, but these are not strict categories. So sometimes the K will often critique epistemology, ontology, and ideology at the same time. So this might be concerning, especially for the 2AC, but that's all right because the K usually reveals itself in the block, especially on framework. The 2 and C slash 1 and R interpretation on framework or sort of guide the way in which you debate framework, right? If the 1 and R says, quote, only evaluate the sort of 1AC's investment in the ideological apparatus of capitalism, for example, that's a very clear example of an ideological based criticism. Sometimes they'll just say that you should evaluate the sort of ideology or maybe philosophical investments of the plan. In that case, that's still somewhat vague, but it sort of gives you a general notion that the negative is trying to say that philosophy comes before the plan. So in terms of framework, structural Ks often approach framework through the lens of ideology, right? So an argument would be, for example, that capitalist ideology tricks debaters into thinking that we can solve things through the lens of the market and capital, which makes us more likely to treat the market and government as some sort of god. This ideological investment affects the world and debaters more than the hypothetical enactments of the plan and the impacts of the plan. Therefore, it matters more than the plan, and that you should reject the plan. Epistemology Ks approach framework through the lens of representation. So securitized threat logic supersedes enactments of the plan. A lot of the times they'll say reps shape reality. And what we take away from debate is not the plan text itself, but how affirmatives have justified it via impact chain claims. Lastly, ontology Ks obviously intuitively approach framework through the lens of ontology. So, for example, Afropessimism, and this explanation kind of proves how little I have gone for Afropessimism. This is not the clearest explanation of it, but for example, the one I see arises from a ruse of progress / humanism. This logic is anti-black and causes violence in debate space that their framework allows. Therefore, we don't get the plan, and critiquing ontological forces and the method of ontology that the 1AC understands and assumes is valid grounds for contestation. I won't talk about Heidegger, but that's just an example for the Heidegger K. So let's take a step back and ask where we are. In any case, the negative best case version of framework is something like the following. In the case of epistemology or security K, epistemology is prior to the hypothetical enactment of the plan. Therefore, they don't get the plan or a permutation. K teams or Ks will say, most of the time, ontology, ideology, epistemology first. No matter what the case is, they'll try to limit your range of permutations and how much offense you can garner off of the impacts and solvency of the plan. Saying, quote, X is prior should trigger alarm bells for you because it signals that they are trying to say that the hypothetical enactment and the impacts of the plan come secondary to the ontology, ideology, or epistemology of the plan. If you think that the permutation is the best 2R to give versus the K, then you must win framework to get a permutation. This is because the permutation relies on the hypothetical enactment of the plan and doesn't actually necessarily happen when the judge votes neg, or affirmative rather. So this means that in the context of attempting to give a permutation argument, the negative team will always say that framework comes prior, and they'll also say that because the 1AC itself invested in problematic ideology, you can't sever out of that problematic ideology, representation, or ontology with the permutation. And that is all a question of framework. So the task for the affirmative then is to prove that at minimum, you do get to leverage the benefits of the hypothetical enactment of the plan versus the K. So you get the impacts of the plan or the versus the impacts of the K, for example. Winning framework helps for a variety of reasons. First, it means that the neg will have no offense and links are non-unique, which means that extinction outweighs. The idea here is that capitalism is non-unique, right? We live in a capitalist world. The F does not actually cause capitalism to cause the impacts that it happens. So the negative needs, in order for the permutation not to resolve the problems with capitalism, the negative will have to win framework, and that this is a sort of valid grounds for contestation. And this allows you to go for a permutation. as I'll detail later. So there are essentially 4 winning 2ARs against the K using or not using framework. First is the most risky and sort of rare version, which is the concession of framework. And you're like, yes, epistemology is prior, but ours is better than theirs. Second is the most aggressive version of framework that says that no Ks are allowed essentially in debate. And this sort of model means that any negative offense is tethered upon an unfair or anti-educational model of opportunity cost comparison. Third is permutation plus framework. So framework as a justification for why the affirmative gets permutations. Reminder, as we mentioned last slide, if the negative wins framework, oftentimes they'll win that there's no valid permutation. So in order to go for the permutation, you need to win framework. Lastly is framework plus the alt fails plus the app outweighs. This is sort of the vanilla version of framework. It essentially allows you to get the offense of the app, compare that with the alternative, and sort of understand and make opportunity cost comparison there. So which way you go should be predetermined by what you think your best 2AR is given your type of affirmative and the judge. So I've roughly outlined 3 types of affirmatives. First, it would be the hard right affirmative. So this would say something like hegemony is good, capitalism is good, and make that a sort of explicit stance on the 1AC. Oftentimes, and maybe counterintuitively, they will attempt to impact turn framework, right? Because if the negative is correct, that debate over the plan or debate solely about the plan is bad and forecloses sort of interrogation of capitalism, the negative or the affirmative will say, well, that is actually fine. We should have debates about the sort of ideological investment in capitalism because capitalism is good. Or we should have debates about investments in hegemony because hegemony is good. Second, and the most popular type of affirmative, the one that you'll probably be reading, is a sort of a typical policy half. I would say that in this case, your path choice is sort of a dealer's choice. It's contingent a lot upon the critique that you're facing, and will make I'll help you make judgments about which choice is best given the particular critique that they're giving. And 2, the judge. If the judge doesn't like Ks, then maybe it's more opportunity for you to say that there should be no Ks allowed, for example. Finally is the hard left style of affirmative, which is meant to permute. It depends largely upon AF and the framework interpretation. Perhaps the affirmative will concede framework. So if the affirmative says that sort of debates about, for example, carbon tax are good because they help mobilize political energy, help students understand climate change more, those are all effects that are not contingent upon the actual enactment of the plan, right? A carbon tax might be hypothetically good, but also debating about the consequences and understanding a carbon tax is a good idea, for example. So in that case, the affirmative can just simply concede framework. But they can also have permutations. So if the 1AC and maybe the 2AC doesn't have the sort of explicit language that the carbon tax example did, right, where the carbon tax is saying that, debating about the carbon tax is a good idea, maybe the affirmative doesn't have that, but maybe the affirmative has a more sort of left-wing style of impact, maybe it's soft left, etc. If in that case, maybe you think that the affirmative aligns closely with the alternative, and in that case, a permutation would be good. So in that case, then you would go for framework and we get a permutation. Now, before we determine the 2AR, obviously the speech that happens before that is the 2NR. And the 2NR will have 3 options, right? First is go for framework no plans. And if this is the case, then you should spend a lot of time on framework, right? Because the negative's essential win condition is that you don't get to weigh the hypothetical enactment of the plan. So in given these 2NRs, the 2NR will not spend the entire speech on framework no plans, but if framework is, a solid 3-4 minute chunk of the 2NR, then that's a pretty good signal that they're going for this style of argument. Second is this sort of hybrid approach. And this is not just to say the hybrid approach that we mentioned earlier. This is to say that the 2NR both goes for a substantive version of the K, so one that has clear links to the plan, a unique alternative that solves case, impacts contingent upon the case and framework. The problem with this sort of hybrid is that it puts it underinvests in both buckets by trying to invest in both, right? one of the more fundamental concepts behind 2AR is that you should spend a lot of time on a few issues. And if you're spending too much time in the 2NR having both substance and framework be alive, while it might seem good in theory because both are good for you, oftentimes both become underdeveloped and allows the affirmative to answer both substantively. And because the 2AR is the last speech and knows the affirmative at a level that should be quite high, they can make a lot of the framework arguments, and especially a lot of the substantive arguments, that as sort of an overextended 2NR cannot make. And lastly is a more substantive approach. So, for example, if you're going for the most offensive version of framework, right, which is to say framework no Ks, as evident here, then if they want to go for substance, then they'll have to answer the idea that we should get no Ks at all, that philosophical principles are not valid grounds for contestation. So in that sense, they'll have to answer framework no Ks, but they're mostly trying to go for sort of substantive argument that justifies the logic, and justifies sort of unique opportunity costs between the plan and the K. So in that case, you can either, if you're going for the aggressive version of framework and saying framework no Ks, then you should obviously spend time on framework because that would delete the substantive portion of the K. Or you can always sort of go for the impact turn permutation alt-fail style. So here I've made a chart. Hopefully this is somewhat helpful. I'm not sure if it will be. This is like a political compass of potential 2AR options, right? So these are all of your options. On the x-axis, you see the propensity to go for the permutation versus the impact turn, right? So permutation is sort of a defensive argument. It agrees with lots of the sort of ideas behind the alternative and says that the AF is compatible with that, so it's a no-link argument. And impact turn is the exact opposite. It says that the AF is exactly those things, but that those things are good, right? So the y-axis then is a question of offensive versus defensive framework. So how much time you want to invest in eliminating the desirability of Ks versus just you get a K, we are AF, now let's have a debate, right? So you'll see here that the framework perm style is in the left quadrant because you want to go for the permutation and go for offensive framework argument. The framework no Ks sort of style is potentially more of an impact turny, less permutation-esque style that says that they do not get permutations. The concession of framework style says that we should just concede framework and say, heck, those representations, that ontological focus is good, we are impact turning, and in that case it is defensive framework. It basically concedes the premise of framework. And secondly lastly, is this bottom left quadrant, the alt fails plus the AF outweighs quadrant, which is to say that we get an affirmative, you don't get to moot our affirmative, but that the alternative fails for a variety of reasons. Okay, so let's talk about each path in particular. The risky concession of framework. Because this sort of conversation I'm having is not specific to, like, it's not just about all K debate, it's more about the framework portion for the affirmative. I don't want to get too much into this style because it's a little bit different. Usually this style is used against epistemology case, although it can be used against both ontology and ideological criticisms. It requires lots of setup and oftentimes requires sort of unique genres of affirmative. For example, if you know that a K team, if you know that a team is going to read a K and be sort of a one-off style of team, then you might want to just say, hey, hedge is good, militarizing debate's a good thing, for example. If they make arguments sort of in that vein, because then you're already ready to impact turn, you're already ready to defend your representations. This also applies to the opposite spectrum of affirmative, so affirmatives that are left-wing and says that debating about the particular nuances of the carbon tax, as I mentioned earlier, for example, that debating about those types of affirmatives is good and helps movements, etc. So in a way, sort of paradoxically, you kind of have a horseshoe, right, where if you're very sort of hard left or hard right, and this is a spectrum that maybe is not totally descriptively accurate, but still is helpful in understanding the idea that maybe these types of affirmatives will not want to talk about framework much at all. But this is also is somewhat risky because this gives the negative lots of the framework sort of arguments that they're making. For example, if you're saying in epistemology K, for example, security, the negative could make sort of this nuanced position that's like, even if securitization or cap or hedge is in principle good, you need defenses of what you did in the 1AC in the debate space. So it requires lots of sort of thinking about what's going on in the first place. One particular example that I've seen a lot is an affirmative will read an impact premised upon like Chinese rise, for example. The negative will say that that's sort of a racist depiction of China that causes material impacts to Asian people in the United States, sort of like hate crimes, for example. And the affirmative will say, well, that doesn't matter because China, we're descriptively accurate. China is a threat. Their government is bad. But that doesn't necessarily answer the negatives issue, which is that the mere representation talking about China in that particular way does cause violence. So, because the plan never happens, in fact, hypothetical enactment of the plan never happens, we're not going to contain China after an F ballot. There's only a risk that the negative is correct, that it causes sort of violence, which is an example of how this could potentially be problematic. Path 2, the aggressive version, is framework no Ks. So this applies to every sort of K because it is basically generic. So what are the pros here? The most obvious pro going for framework no Ks is that it's a very easy, clear, objective win condition, right? It allows you to tell a judge in the 2IR that the only thing that matters in this debate is framework, and if we win framework, that means that they don't get the alternative, they don't get their impacts, they don't get links. So in this way, it's basically generic because you can say it against any genre of K and it'll probably apply, and it at least gives you some mode of debate. So at the very worst case, if there's a critique that you don't have an answer to, that's being broke new against you, or you just can't find your blocks, for example, you always sort of have the out of saying, well, framework no Ks, so you don't get a K. The path and the 2IR sort of structure and idea behind it is fairly simple. The 2IR will say something like fairness outweighs, using the fairness paradox. Very briefly, the fairness paradox says that because debate's a competition in which the neg wants to win too, both sides sort of axiomatically value fairness and rely upon it. So saying that fairness isn't an impact in debate is silly. That's the fairness paradox. And they'll also apply the fairness paradox with balanced solvency arguments, sort of presumption style arguments. So if you've been neg against a KF and someone said, hey, go for presumption, this applies equally here. The basic premise is simply that voting negative does not solve the impacts, the representational, the ideological, the ontological impacts that they say they do. So the only thing that matters is fairness in the debate space. 2, then you have to isolate the internal link for the K, right? So you have to say that Ks in general are unfair. 1, they sort of are unpredictable. They shift debate to the quote other section of the library. And they're also can defend basically anything, and that's unfair. There's no ground against it because the status quo is hard to defend. So status quo ideology, status quo representation is hard to defend, etc. And they'll always get to choose the focus of the debate, which is hard to debate from the perspective of the affirmative. Now, the cons here is that it's very hard to win with a lot of judges who like more philosophical / critical arguments. Most judges, I would say, don't love this path of framework, but some that don't like it will still vote for you if you outdebate them. So if you get very good at saying that Ks are bad, then you can kind of rely upon it as a generic. But the problem is that its generic sort of presence means that the negative has a large internal link to a lot of their framework offense, because it means that you're basically excluding, deleting, removing, whatever word we want to say, every sort of type of K, which seems bad. An ontological K will say that this leads to an exclusion of critical perspectives in debate. If the ontology K is premised upon particular groups of debaters, then that seems particularly bad. Second is ideology Ks that allows X ideology to go unchecked in debate, which makes us evil. We literally don't ever have any ideological based criticisms. Lastly, is the epistemology based K for example, security that says that, because representative reality, not allowing any representational critique in debate allows that sort of bad research, that bad affective practice to go unchecked. So the best version of the two ARs I kind of preluded to would be the fairness outweighs, fairness paradox, fairness filters education because the game's unfair and we won't learn if, the game's unfair because the only reason we're here is because we want to win. And then the sort of presumption style arguments. No one gets more or less violent in debate because of competition. People view wins and losses as technical successes or technical failures, not actually informing ideology, which is informed by stuff much outside the debate space. We go to debate tournaments for about 3% of our year. The rest is more influential in determining ideology. Debaters make silly arguments all the time, not believing them, etc. So you should focus less in this sense on the internal links because you kind of are removing lots of Ks, and focus more about impact calculus and presumption style arguments when you're going for framework. No Ks. The third path you can take is permutation and framework. These are particularly good against ideology Ks, although they can be deployed against the other two types. So what are the pros with saying we get an AF in permutation and you get a critique? Well, it seems very defensible because permutations are good. Fairness, right? As I detailed pretty extensively in episode 1, the logic of the permutation filters the idea that the negative can present any form of advocacy that might link. That is basically good. The affirmative is constrained to the resolution and making sort of clear demands upon the state. So if the negative is just not that, then it seems like any sort of permutation would be very problematic in a sense, right? Like not allowing permutations means that the negative has a wide variety of arguments that they can say that seem to be problematic and unfair. Second, is sort of clash related reasons. So you could make this a sort of typical framework fairness style clash, education, learning about debate, that's, ground, etc. is key. But especially for permutations, it seems like permutations foster a unique sense of clash, right? It allows sort of movements and a variety of different people to sort of hash out the nuances behind, which exact unique state policies are good and bad. How they can be combined and tailored to a sort of more progressive movement, etc. That sort of nuanced focus is sort of a requirement of permutation debate that the negative team will disallow because, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the negative attempts will be a lot of negative framework is a lot of the times attempting to remove the permutation because they think that the permutation is very good against the alternative. So that means that this version of framework enables a permutation win condition, which is very good against large utopian alternatives, which I'll talk about in a second. It also, as I mentioned earlier, gives you sort of generic fairness presumption style, but in contrast to framework no Ks, there's less of an internal link to their offense, right? There's less of a link to the exclusion stuff. And additionally, you can go for more clash style framework arguments with this too, if that's what you prefer. Even more pros is that this is good with a lot of affirmative setups that are more progressive / left-wing in nature. It means that it's, if you're to consider the policy outside of the context of debate, right? So if we're to be like, let's say the affirmative is like universal healthcare for whatever reason, that seems like a fairly progressive idea. The negative will say it's not progressive because, it uses the state, pragmatism, etc. But if you want to have those debates on the affirmative, if you want to say the state is key, the state is good, the state's inevitable, pragmatism is good, resolving material impacts is good. If you want to have that sort of debate with your unique form of affirmative, then this model of framework definitely allows that and permits that because all of those styles of arguments are net benefits to the permutation. There are reasons why the permutation is better than the alternative alone, which means that even if they have defense to the permutation, like even if the permutation doesn't 100% solve all of the negative's offense, well, the affirmative also has some offense that only the permutation solves, that the alternative does not. Lastly, and most importantly, is that this path of framework is very, very good against lots of styles of Ks that have very large alternatives. For example, the cap K, this is the most common path for the affirmatives to take. The reason for this is because the cap K has become more and more now a question of, quote, philosophical competition, which is basically ideological competition. So it's to say that, which philosophies, which ideologies the one I see invested in, the negative can say that those ideologies are bad. But the real question, the important thing is to understand that a lot of the time these alternatives and these impacts will not be about the app particularly, right? Like this is why these sort of genres of Ks are afraid of the permutation. That's why they're spending so much time on framework attempting for you not to have a permutation, is because lots of these links and these alternatives are not very specific to the affirmative, which means that a permutation seems like a very good option. And I'll talk more about that in a second. Now, there's some cons of this approach. First is that it kind of sucks that the permutation fails, right? Because then you spent all this time trying to get the permutation and then it doesn't work out for you, and then you just lose the debate. Second is that the win condition is a lot less clear than path 2, which is framework no Ks, which makes sense because you still have to win the permutation. And maybe potentially it's too middle ground, right? Because they'll still have some offense on framework regardless, so you're not completely obfuscating the idea of debating framework and debating their offense, but you still have to answer a lot of their arguments on other sort of things, and you're sort of spending a lot of time on framework, the permutation. Maybe this is sort of an overinvestment, right? So let's talk about the 2AR for this sort of path of framework. First is permutations are good, and their interpretation is just a way to get out of permutation. This is really bad for debate, as I said, because permutations are important, because the negative just having a potentially competitive advocacy means that they get the magic world peace wand. The negative will say that this prevents ideological conversation, but I don't think that this actually answers this argument, because if the alternative literally dismantles all of world capitalism, then the AF using the market once isn't going to stop this. The AF is not really that big of an ideological investment in capitalism compared to the complete other ways in which debaters understand capitalism, right? Like whether a debater thinks capitalism is good or bad is not determined by whether or not a debater gets access to a permutation or not. Whereas the access to the permutation does have a very tangible, clear impact on the fairness implications of the round. Second is defense to their offense. So there are other ways to test ideology besides no permutation, right? The logic of a permutation is actually able to test more ideological investments because it allows for more nuance. So our interpretation is key to more germane link and alternative arguments that are best for K-debate, because the best forms of K-debate are typically the ones in which the negative has clear links to the AF and the AF has clear offense through those links, right? Because then those critical investments become actual grounds for contestation, not just that the AF used the market, which, is a link, clearly, but maybe not specific as we would want. And then you can also apply the fairness presumption style arguments, the causes, the stuff I said above. Third is the link turn to their offense. So their logic of framework essentially allows the AF just to fiat anything under the guise of ideological or philosophical competition. That itself is anti-educational under their own standard, because we don't get to learn what choices we make in revolutions. We don't get to understand which sort of practices we think the state should invest in, how we can orient ourselves with or around the state. We don't really have debates over those issues because the negative, under their model, and what's kind of increasingly happening, is that the negative just has a very large alternative that solves lots of issues with the status quo. So let's talk about the 1AR now that we're moving from the 2AR backwards for the 1AR. So the bread and butter version of the 1AR for this style framework is one framework. Yes, we get a permutation. Outlined that your framework interpretation is very clearly not excluding all types of Ks. So I think the interpretation, if you just want to copy and paste this, is framework weigh the hypothetical effects of the plan and permutation versus competitive and solvent alternative. I would say, just as a little tip, you should send out your framework interpretation in the document itself. So you should, if you have the analytics feature on verbatim, I would not put your framework interpretation under that. I'd put it under a tag or something. Or at the very least, you should go slowly and clearly flag that you're saying weigh the plan and permutation. And you should say that most of your offense is tied to the idea that having permutations are good. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly, is permutation do both, which is framed as, quote, the permutation double bind. Now, here are both sides of the bind. Either the permutation solves because the alternative, which the permutation includes, is very large. For example, in the context of the CAPK, does socialism internationally, maybe fiat's a revolution in the United States that goes well, or the alternative can't overcome the issues to the idea, the reason why the alternative can't happen in the status quo, right? So, for example, let's say the CAPK alternative, let's say it's just the revolution alternative. Well, there's lots of reasons why a revolution's not happening right now in the United States, right? The military would say no. It's just not very popular of an idea, to be quite frank. All those things the alternative has to sort of increase or get rid of. So they have to increase the popularity of socialism. Maybe the military converts. These are all good cross-ex questions for the 1 and C on the CAPK, by the way. So, those sort of questions, maybe the alternative can overcome those. And if they do overcome all the other structural factors that I just mentioned, then it can probably overcome the affirmative, right? Finally, I would say alt fails because you could say something like transition wars, states are key, no one converts, etc. And if the 2 and C 1 and R says that we fiat past that and the alternative solves, there you go. That is your magical ticket for the permutation double bind, right? Because then they basically give you the version of the bind that gives you the permutation solvency portion. The first bullet point, the first aspect of the bind, which is that the permutation solves because the alternative is very large, right? If they're fiating past or imagining past, whatever word they want to use, past the issues with the status quo, then that means that the permutation likely resolves and doesn't get really hampered by the affirmative. So that is the double bind. No K-links are actually about the plan for the most part, so you should specify potentially that their links are about the topic generically or the market generically, not about the plan, and that under this logic, they're all non-unique dissads which the alternatives must solve. So if the judge does not think that the alternative solves these non-unique dissads, then these are dissads with the status quo that do not hamper the desirability of the plan. But it also means that the alternative must solve lots of these other issues with capitalism. This double bind puts the affirmative in a very good spot, and to be frank, it's very tough for the negative to answer without framework because ideology-based Ks sort of almost always require framework to answer the permutation. Reminder that this is the reason why they're spending so much time on framework, because they don't want you to get the permutation, right? So justifying the permutation, as we mentioned above, is very important. Final pathway for framework is the sort of vanilla version of framework. I say that this is the most standard version of framework, which is framework plus the F ways. So this is very good against most types of Ks, but especially against Ks with smaller alternatives. So let's think about the pros here. So a reminder that this version of framework says that we get the affirmative outweighs the alternative. So it is in nature very defensive. It simply says that we get an F, which is easy to argue for because, in a lot of cases, some K-teams will just say, yeah, sure, you do get an F and you get to meet in the 1ER, and then you actually have the debate about the alternative versus the plan. A lot of judges find that this version is very, very intuitive and seems good because it allows for critical debate, but it doesn't mean that debate always sort of becomes unfair. It's also quite responsive to a lot of more than meta Ks that are arising, especially in high school, which are essentially just attempts to moot the plan. So there will be lots of spam on framework, lots of subpoints, etc. And this version is the best at responding to it because your sort of theme is very simple, right? The theme is simply that there's no link to a lot of your offense. We get the plan, etc. You get the alternative. This enables lots of alternative fails arguments. So, micropolitics fails, focus on representations, ontology fails, etc. And it enables, decent deployment of the more traditional framework arguments. So, focusing on ontology, for example, means that we can't focus the material violence that exists in the world, or we can't solve extinction because we're so sort of preoccupied in thinking about philosophy and stuff. You can still make the fairness presumption arguments I mentioned, but you can also make the clash arguments if you would like. Now, there are also some very clearly identifiable cons with this sort of approach. The win condition becomes much more focused on the alternative versus the affirmative. So, in some cases, this means that it's very hard if the alternative is large. In this case, I'd recommend going for path 3 because it allows you to get that permutation double bind that's so juicy, so sweet. You still have to spend a decent amount of time on framework, especially if the tuner is going for the more offensive, no plan version of framework. So, this sort of approach, you kind of would like to talk about the AF versus the alternative. You like to make the state inevitable, the state key, the micropolitics fails style of argument. But if the tuner is just going to go for framework anyways, then, you don't get exactly what you wanted. It also enables some strange hybrid approaches that might be losing. So the judge might conclude that it's kind of hard to say that representations in epistemology don't matter, that there's clearly an impact to them, or that there's clearly an impact to ideology or ontology. So the plan happens, but so does the representation, and it's confusing to decide which matters more necessarily. So it would be a lot easier, in principle, to just say, do strategy 2, which is to say, no reps, only the plan matters, which lends less credence to that sort of judge intervention, that sort of judge confusion. Now, the way in which you go for this path is determined mostly by the block in the 2NR. So I'll begin with the 1ER first. The 1ER should think, how much of the block was framework? How much were plan-specific links that the alt fails? And how did they answer alt fails arguments, right? And the answers to these questions should elucidate how much time you spend on the framework and the AF outweighs portion of your 1ER and 2ER, right? Because the substantive portion, if the block is mostly talking about substance, then that's good. You got what you wanted, right? They're not talking about this framework as much. That's good. We get the AF. That's great. But if they are spending a decent amount of time on framework in the block, then you have to answer all those arguments. And for example, I think a decent tell is that if they want to go for the sort of more offensive version of framework for the negative, which is to say that you don't get to plan, is that the 1NR, the 2NC will do the overview, the impact, the alternative, and the links. And the 1NR will do the framework and the permutation, for example. That sort of block split is very traditional framework heavy because the 1NR is spending lots of time on framework, oftentimes 3 minutes, 4 minutes-esque on framework, and that's a lot of time. The 1ER itself is only 5 minutes, so you have to spend a decent amount of time there. At least, if we were to think about it in terms of, let's say, 4 minutes of the 1NR was framework. If it was a 13-minute high school block, 4 minutes divided by 13 minutes is about 33% of the block was framework, right? So the 1ER should spend, I don't know, 30-ish% of the time on framework. And it kind of sucks to get through all that slog, but it's something that you have to have to do with a lot of these cases. But if the 2NC takes framework in 1 minute 30, 2 minutes, maybe they say we get a K, should very clearly flow their interpretation, and if they don't give you their interpretation and you don't have it, no shame in asking. It's a lot better than not knowing what it is. If it's very defensive, then there you go. You get the AF outweighs portion. The 1ER can just say we meet their interpretation under some cases. Sometimes there will be sort of an instance in which the block on the K will try to have both alive, so both a substantive and a framework section alive. And you kind of have to answer both, right? So you have to be very cognizant of how much time they're spending on each and what you think is more threatening with your affirmative, right? If you think that, permutation is very good, you think that your 2A can wrap it up, think that your 2A can give a good speech on the perm double bind, then spend more time on framework if that's what you're worried about, right? Then the 2NR happens. So 1ER happens, does a great job because you listened to all my fantastic advice. The 2NR happens, and the 2A is now like, okay, what is the judge going to vote for in this 2NR? Like, what do the 2NR spend the most time on? Is it a purely framework-based K? What am I more likely to lose on, right? Am I more likely to lose on their framework that's offensive, or that the alternative solves in the more substantive portion? If A, then logically spend more time on framework, and if B, spend more time on the alt fails, right? And that should make sense, right? You know, but it requires a clear understanding of what you think the affirmatives, or rather the negatives win conditions are, and identifying those. So the 2AR setup will be very conditional on the 1ER. Sorry for the typo. The most important part of the speech will probably be the alt fails and the alpha outweighs portion, right? And you should sort of have this mindset of placing offense, like link impact turns on link arguments. This is like a good headspace, I think, in a lot of cases for some of these Ks. So let's say one of the Ks is like a fiat/state bad K, like using the state, imagining yourself being the state is bad. You probably have to answer the fiat K more on framework, but you can also say that using the state's good, right? And because each link argument has to be resolved by the alternative must naturally take the opposite stance of the link, right? So if they say using the state's bad, then the alternative cannot use the state, right? That seems logical. So you could say the state's inevitable, the state's key to solve large impacts. So this is obviously AF contingent. So, the state might be key to solve all internal links. If your AF's about, building an alliance with NATO, then you can be like, well, clearly the state's key to build allies with NATO, right? Because NATO is a state-based collective. I haven't seen any micro-political movements in NATO that have changed their strategy vis-a-vis Russia, for example. And that means that the alternative fails to solve their offense as well. So if you say that micropolitics generally as a strategy fails, that means that they can't solve maybe their more structural, philosophical-based impacts, because that is maybe more of a material impact. So for example, if there's lots of inequality, and let's say you're reading an app about the environment and you want to clean up the environment, and the neg says the way in which we clean up the environment is predicated on sort of a logic, an ontology perhaps of sort of violence, perhaps anti-blackness, and we should instead not use the state. We should reject the notion of progress, etc. Well, if the alternative is to sort of build sort of maybe collectives, maybe be more individually focused on our sort of unrepresentational practice, then you can say that the alternative fails to solve their discrimination-based racism-esque, anti-blackness offense, because it's not going to be actualized. It's not going to resolve the material effects of that violence, for example. If they do not spend much time on framework node plans and spend more time on substance, then you should spend less time on framework in this path in particular than any other path besides the concession path, right? Because then you sort of get what you want. I would spend maybe roughly 30 seconds in fairness on clash, give some defense to their offense, which will be pretty easy because the idea, the good part about this path is that you have lots of defensive ins to responding to defense, because you're basically giving them the K. You're just saying, hey, we need our affirmative, right? So in that case, there's not a lot of exclusion of K and critical perspectives here. And then, if you want to say cap good, that can be the portion of the app outweighs. That can be the portion of the alt fails. If the 2NR is more clearly in the no plan approach, then you have to spend more time on framework. You should be sure to answer every piece of defensive framework and provide a very clear internal link. I think as I sort of mentioned earlier, the meta with lots of critiques is now becoming more focused on framework node plans, and a lot of these debaters are getting very good at technically going for that strategy. So you need to spend more time flowing and working on answering most arguments. The problem here is that for the negative, benefit for you all is that most judges don't really want to moot the plan. So even in, let's say the 2NR says 15 total arguments on framework node plans. Let's say you get to sub 0.5, you say like one quick thing. Maybe let's say you make 1.5-ish arguments. You say one clear thing, one thing that kind of doesn't make sense. You'll probably be fine. Obviously, this is sort of judge dependent, right? Like if the judge is very sort of like in the weeds in philosophy, you should make note of that and be like, okay, this judge is more clearly, a sort of critically oriented person. Let's make adjustments here. And then in that case, I would focus maybe more on a permutation style approach. Um, or, but in most cases, you'll probably be fine just being like, we answered every single argument. There's defense. We answered all their defense to our offense. Um, this is sort of a skill that requires lots of drilling. If you tend to lose, in the 2AR and the 1AR to framework and the F outweighs, or sorry, to framework no plans, that's actually a very common, sort of universal debater experience. This happens even at the very highest levels because this sort of argument is very tough to answer because there's lots of proliferation of arguments and the 1AR has to answer lots of things. And if you concede something, then they'll blow it up in your face and you just feel kind of in a bad position, right? In any case, if this is something that you are worried about, I would consider perhaps flowing some of the best college 2NRs on framework and thinking through your 2AR and 1AR toolkit and answering all those sort of arguments because they're not great arguments, at least for most judges. Maybe sometimes they're more persuasive than other times, but again, it's more contingent upon how much of a link they're winning and how much of the alternative they're winning. So the easiest version for the neg is just to say firm no plans, and teams are getting very naturally good at this in the same way that it's very easy to win on a process counterplan. The only thing you have to really focus on in a process counterplan is process counterplan's good and answering competition, right? So it's very similar sort of thing. Debaters are getting very, very good at answering one particular style of argument or going for one particular style of argument and sort of getting involved in that and being specialized. So if you are concerned about this, I would say that I wouldn't really worry about this because as you become more technical, as you get better at flowing line by line, efficiently answering arguments, all those things are very, very important here, then you can sort of be in a very good place answering this. And I would say, there's lots of attempts to drill with this sort of particular style of argument. So let's conclude this. We first outlined that framework can be either defensive or offensive from the perspective of being affirmative, and that's sort of contingent upon which style of affirmative you have, what style of a judge you have, what path you're taking on framework, and what the 2NR and what the 2NC is saying on framework. And you want to find what sort of mix of offense and defense you are taking via choosing what path you're taking. You should determine which style of 2AR you most likely want to give versus most types of Ks as part of your AF prep. So think about, sort of the three to five most prominent critiques on your particular topic. Let's say it's cap, security, cybernetics, Afro-pessimism, and Heidegger. Whatever. Cap, I want to go for permutation do both plus framework. Maybe security, if I get a judge who doesn't like Ks, I'll go for framework no Ks, but if not, I'll impact turn, I'll say that my representations are actually good. Militarizing the climate is good, something like that. Cybernetics, the cybernetics alt, I don't think it solves our impacts or their impacts, so maybe I'll just go for the fourth path, the framework and the F outweighs path. Any sort of case, you can make the decision yourself. I hope I gave you a nice little toolkit and understanding maybe sort of the more technical nuances of that decision. But the important part is that you are making the decision, that you do have a plan when thinking about framework before the 2AC even says the word one framework, right? And you should be cognizant of what the 2NC and 2NR interpretation is, right? Is it deleting your AF? Is it allowing for their AF? Is it something in between? All these matter and sort of reflect upon what style of framework debating that you will want to be giving. I hope that this was helpful for some of y'all. If you have any comments, feedback, questions, we'll be happy to answer it. And yes,